Hi guys, I'm James Fitch from Prok Fitch, and wanted to welcome you to our Brighton studio, sunny Brighton studio today. We're going to be looking at a track of our forthcoming Do Not Sleep EP. It's called Tarzan. We're going to look at how we made it, the beats and the groove, and how we arranged it, and how we go about making our tracks, and give you a bit of an insight into that. So hope you enjoy. So when we originally wrote this, we wanted to do something that was tracky. We kind of balanced the records that we made to make stuff that is like a peak time banger, but also write stuff that fits into our set at any point, and is a bit more of a roller rather than making such a statement, to a dance floor. It's something that would just fit effortlessly in amidst different records that we're playing. So that was the aim behind this record, to write something that was tracky, that was stripped, didn't have too much going on, but had a killer groove that would work in the context of our DJ set, whether it be kind of more peak time or earlier on or later on. So yeah, that was the ethos behind this record. Most of the time when we start writing something, we'll always have an idea first. It could be like a vocal, a sample or something like that. In this case, it was that bit of vocal, and also this vocal that we've got in the break. Hence the fact it's called Tarzan. We tend to get something as an idea before we start, and then we start with the beat. So in this case, we didn't really need to run those with the beat. So we started with a kick and the clap, and the way we normally go about working that is find a sample that we like. In this case, let's go straight to the kick. We use Metrum here, which is a Vengeance plugin on the kick. It's great. You can just throw your kick into it, filter out any sound that you don't want, or any hats that are tagged onto the end of it, and then the clap. Let's have a look at the clap. Is actually imported from another project. Normally we'd have Contact open and just audition through different claps until we find one that we like. So on the kick, that's running into the drums channel, which has got a vintage warmer on it, just to add a little bit of distortion to it, and crunch it all together, and no EQ at all. And then I'll show you the master as well. To be honest, there's not that much stuff on here. There's just the invisible limiter, and the fab filter EQ, which is more just for doing high passes, as we tend to like high pass everything on the master out. On the clap, we've got the little radiator, Sound Toys. We use the Sound Toys plugins loads on pretty much everything. It's super handy. Their stuff is really easy to use, and it kind of does exactly what we need it to do. We've boosted the EQ on here as well, just to brighten it up a little bit. And there's an Onboys delay on there, which we used later on in the break, which I'll show you in a bit. And just the bottom rolled off to 100 Hertz. So pretty simple really, the way we start building our groove. We'll get the kick and a clap and a hat, which in this case is from a loop, and then start auditioning through loops. In this case, this is really super stripped, this track is. We've actually been stripping back our stuff quite a bit more over the last year, just using less but making more of what we're using. So a little hat in there, which we've got just a bit of the bottom rolled off, not a great deal of processing. We tend to work at a 50% swing, and then just kind of build everything around that. A lot of the time though, we will just move stuff slightly off, just so it has a bit more vibiness to it. there's a loop, so the next thing we'll look at is this loop, top loop at the bottom here. Which has got that little bit of vocal in, and I'll solo it. It's actually just off an a cappella, so it's just a bit of vocal, and that's just as it's come out, basically time stretched. We didn't quantize it, just like the feel of it, and it worked in the context of the groove as well. And because it's so stripped, kind of everything just kind of worked really nicely together. We've got that 16th hat in there, which I'll solo for you on its own. Let's give it a bit of pace. We stuck the phase mistress on it. If I just turn that off, it's just like a plain 16th hat, but kind of that adds an instant vibe to the drums and kind of makes them a little bit more recognisable as soon as you start the track. You get those straight away. So they're pretty much the drums. To be honest, if I'd opened up any other track, I could have spent an hour going through the drums with you, but this is kind of all about the simplicity, really. And there's a few extra little bits that kind of make the drums a bit more interesting. Just a little hat accent there that's just got a bit of the bottom rolled off. Little open hat that comes in there, again just a bit of the bottom rolled off, and just to show you kind of our workflow of how we work when we're going through and looking for hats, we'll just have the sequence drawn in on the MIDI, and then just audition through until we find the hat that we want. So you can see there's a few more choices there. Always devil's advocate, we can literally go back to a hat, you know, the day before we bounce it out for a pre-master and change it, because just I think over time you get used to hearing something and you want it to sound different, or you just change your mind. But I'll show you, we just go through with the groove playing. That other one sounded pretty good. Yeah, and that's pretty straightforward, really. So they're the drums. If we have a look at the bass now, I'll solo that for you to start with. This is off the bassline 101, which we use for a lot of our bass lines now. It's a great kind of old school synth, which you can now get hardware version of, actually. Which is definitely on the gear list. Keep going to turn it up. So the bass line's actually made up of there's two parts to it, because rather than automate the length of the lower note in, I just moved it down and changed it on the synth. So the only kind of difference really between the two synths is if I put them both together like that, as you can see, the release and the sustain are a little bit higher up, which just kind of gives a bit more length to that note. It just felt like it needed that in the context of the groove to work properly. We'll look at the top layer to start with. Not a huge amount on there, just a bit of EQ around 100 Hertz. It does feed into a group as well, just force of habit, just if stuff needs compressing. But in this case, we've just got a bit of EQ on there and that's it. And on the bass channel itself, there is the Maserati, which is a Waves plugin, adds some really cool distortion to it. It's great for taking bass sound, or we use it on hats and drums and stuff sometimes as well, but in the context of the bass, it just really brings a sound to life that's maybe lacking a little bit of something. If I turn it off, you can see it's like a little bit preset-y sounding. It adds the beef and distortion like exactly where you need it for that kind of power in the club. Also got sidechain on there as well, this other Vengeance sidechain, which is really easy to use. You can choose the frequencies you want to sidechain as well. The low note in. So it's just very few elements basically working together to make it quite a simple strip groove. So I've just noticed another little bit of perk in here as well that actually has nothing on it at all. That is just a sample from a sample pack, a Raw Loops sample pack. Their stuff tends to be really heavily processed, so it's great because you can just dump the sound straight in, and a lot of the time they don't really need anything else. So let's have a look as we move on. There's a few effects in here. We've got this little wonky sound at the bottom. Kind of atmospheric thing, which is off the 101 as well. Kind of tend to find some really cool, weird little things on there that are handy just to whack in there. Because the track is so stripped, we were kind of quite selective on making sure that the little bits that we put in there added enough to, to make it memorable or have an impact, basically. We've got one here as well. Again, just the bottom rolled off. So let's have a look at the break, what we did with these sounds in the break. The bass was just changed slightly, the pattern slightly, just to make it a little bit less monotonous. And then on this vocal you can hear there's a kind of zappiness as it builds. It's pretty random. I'd like to tell you that I did something really special with it, but unfortunately I didn't. I just whacked it through the phase mistress on this phaser attack preset, and basically just up the mix is what gives it that zap on top. If we look at what else is on there as well, there's just a little bit of delay, sound shifter, so it's just pitched up one semitone and then just bottom end rolled off it, and that's what gives it that kind of zappy building effect as it comes up. And also, what else we got? We've literally just got a little bit of snare action going on there as it's building up, which has just got a little bit of EQ on it, and that's it really. The bass filters down, and yeah, that automates up with a tiny volume on that vocal as it goes down, on the volume automation rather than on the synth itself, because you can just automate the output on there as well. And a little kick roll at the end before it drops. And then there's that little vocal on the drop as well, which has just got a little bit of delay on it, and some EQ as well. We tend to use these Cubase EQs a lot, as you can see from every channel, rather than an external EQ, just because it's great the colour they give when you're EQing them through whatever plugins you've got. If you've got some distortion on something, these EQs add a little bit more warmth and just a bit more sound, coloured sound to whatever it is you're EQing. And in this case, when you're writing something as stripped back as this, then it's great to kind of have a bit of that texture. A little bit of 16th percussion that comes in there, the lead into the break, and that's just a bit of minimal percussion, nothing on that either really, just a bit of EQ. It has just what we wanted, it just does what we wanted it to do, something that was just a bit weird, and we kind of would have written in the 16th pattern on that as well and just flicked through sounds until it worked in the context of what we wanted it to do. In the main break, we've got a Moog in there as well, so let's have a look at that. And what we did here is use the bass, the same notes as the bass, and drag them down into the Moog. And what automation have we got going on there? It's just the cutoff on the filter basically that's giving it a bit of change as it goes up. Just when you thought it was going to come in and it didn't, it looped. So on this we've got the Maserati again, adding some distortion, and the bottom rolled off, and the Echo Boys delay, which isn't automating either, that's just literally adding an 1/8 delay to it, just to get it sat in there right. And after the drop, we've got the vocal again, and the Moog comes back in again here. So when we arranged this, we kind of wanted to make sure that after the break there was still something else to keep it interesting, which is why we used the Moog again. But I'll talk about the arrangement now, and we'll look at that, and that will kind of make a little bit more sense. So started off here with a high pass, pretty standard intro really, just starting with the drums on a high pass and the bass as well, adding the little hat accent in, just to keep things interesting. High pass comes off to 16. And then there on the snare, there's a few places here where it's just littered like a slightly different pattern, just to give you something different to listen to, so it's not too monotonous, because it is pretty tracky, this thing is. So using the same parts, but just trying to keep it as interesting as possible without things sounding like they're happening differently, if that makes sense. Little pre-clap comes in and the effect as well, just grooves before the break, and then off hat comes in. And here where the off hat comes in, we automated the phase mistress off, just because that open hat kind of is a bit phasey sounding, and it was clashing with the phasing that was happening on the 16th hat, so we just automated it off there. There's enough going on there for that hat not to really need to cut through with the phasing on it. And then as it goes back into the break, there's a little high pass up here. Comes off a beat late, just so it's not super formulaic. And coming to the break, that phase mistress comes back on the hat. And just the drums drop out, a few bits muted there, that then come back in as it starts building. The hat. And then comes back in there just with everything back in. Grooves for another 32 with a little hat thing there, which just pitches up one semitone each time. And then just leading into the break here, while it's still grooving, that 16th perk comes in. And then adding the Moog in there just to make it different from the last break. We'll always try and make sure that two breaks are never the same. We'll never like cut and paste what's in one break to the other obviously to the other break. Obviously there's elements that are very similar, but like the snare pattern changes there, so it's slightly different to the first break. The bass doesn't run through there, that kind of those shortened bass notes don't run through there, and the automation is slightly different on the vocal as well, so that you actually hear the vocal first without the zapping coming up on it, and then we've got the Moog in there as well just to bring an extra element to it to keep it interesting. So yeah, those subtle little differences to make sure when you're on the dance floor and you're kind of locked in this groove endlessly, there's something extra that's there just to keep you engaged basically. Drops back in with these little subtle snare differences here that try and again put them in different places so that you're not expecting to hear them at the end of every 16 or at the end of every 8, doing something slightly different each time. And then the Moog back in there again, just running into the lead out and a little high pass. And a little snare roll as well there, just to try and keep the energy going as it rolls along. And then just the mix out, dropping the off hat, and then eventually dropping the bass here and going to a high pass. So it is a little bit music by numbers of tech house, and that's it. That's the arrangement. So if I was gonna put this into a genre, it would definitely be tech house, although we have kind of used elements of like the 101 is a pretty popular acid synth. It's got kind of all those old school acidy sounds on there, but I'd definitely say, although there is inspiration from acid stuff, we're always going back to old 90s records, looking for inspiration. Love all the sounds of those records from that genre, from that era of music. So I think even subconsciously we're always going to be influenced by that era of music. So for streaming, what we tend to do is we'll take this club version, which has, you know, obviously it's formatted to be able to work for DJs, hence the intro and the outro, but Spotify wants stuff that's to the point, sub 4 minutes. So yeah, once we've finished the track and we've played it out, we've tested it and we're happy with it, we'll then work on a shortened Spotify edit, which will just cut down a great deal of the intro, maybe shorten the breaks depending on what else there is going on in the track. In this case, we'd probably leave the breaks as they are because they're not hugely long, and there's not a great deal more to the track than, you know, it being about the groove. So we'd cut it down to like 3.5 minutes quite easily, to be honest. Do we tune our drum sounds? Yes, we do. Not the kick. We don't tune the kick, but we do tune like toms or any perk that is you know, going to clash with the bass line or anything like that. We tend to tune it. If little things like this 16th percussion here, you know, we just kind of bring it in straight from whatever sample pack we found it on, and because we're listening on a loop, we'll just have the track looping and going through, literally flicking through different sounds as I showed you with the hats. If it works, it works. Like sometimes we'll hear a sound that we'll put in there and we'll need to change the pitch on it if it's clashing, but a lot of the time I think the magic comes from things just sounding good as they are without having to think too much about the musicality of it. Neither Ben or I are overly musical as far as, you know, playing instruments or anything like that, so for us, if it sounds good, it works. But saying that, you know, if anything clashes, we will both notice that as well. So I think it is important to tune things around things that are very musical, but if it's just groovy stuff like this, you're not really going to have too many issues. But there are certain things like toms or any little like synth stabs and things like that, of course, they're always going to need tuning. So we just love the 101 because the music we're making now, because it does have some inspiration drawn from, you know, the 90s house and the acid house. I think even just the presets on there, it's so easy to use. As you're flicking through, you know, you hear a sound, and even though it will sound kind of quite presetty and basic, once you start throwing stuff over it and just playing around with, you know, the frequency and the res and the bits of modulation, it can make stuff sound a lot more interesting and kind of add a current twist to it. But I'd say when we start our tracks, we probably bassline wise just always use this. It's got a great sound to it without it sounding too fat, if that makes sense. If you're trying to make stuff that was, you know, back in the 90s, they didn't have all the plugins and all the gear that we have now. It was just more about, you know, finding the right synths to give you the sound that you wanted, and this kind of does that for us perfectly, really, with the music that we're making. So where do we find our samples from for inspiration and stuff is a good question, because there's no real set format. We tend to come across things if we're listening to a record, and you know, able to sample little bits off it, old acapellas, YouTube. There's literally endless amounts of inspiration pretty much everywhere that could just be someone talking about something random on the introduction of a YouTube video that you hear some magic in, or an acapella that, you know, you cut and chop up. These vocals are from an old 80s record, and we used a plugin to kind of extract them off, which is why they've got that weird phasery kind of sound to them, because if they were kind of sampled clean, you'd probably be able to tell what they were and we'd get into trouble. So you can get away with sampling a lot of stuff these days, although I probably shouldn't say that. but it kind of adds a bit of magic to the vocal as well, the fact that it sounds shit. So in this case it just works perfectly. But there's just so many different endless sources of inspiration when it comes to finding vocals. I think it's just about having your ear constantly tuned in to the idea of potentially finding something, whether you're just even out having dinner and something comes on, you know, in a restaurant or in a bar or wherever you are, and you kind of hear something and you're straight away like, hey, what was that? Like, what was that record? Or you Shazam it, and you know, and you're able to find a little piece of that or get it resung. So that's the way that we work as producers, is that we'll always look for an idea first. Before we start anything, we need to have that inspiration before we can start writing a track. We don't just sit down and start playing. It's got to be, it could be a bass sample, it could be like a bass line off an old record, or a drum loop or a vocal, but yeah, we need something to start with basically. Yeah, for creative processing, I'd say the Sound Toys stuff is great. The Phase Mistress will always throw that on a drum loop. If it's a quick 16th hat like we have in this track, it just makes things a little bit more interesting. There's some really cool presets on there. They've got a plugin called the Filter Freak too, which we use quite a bit. And if you've got like a groove going, but you want something that's just going to make it a little bit weirder or stand out a little bit more, which we always try and do with our drums, we always try and make our drums stand out, then you can just flick through a few of those presets until something interesting happens, and then start modifying that plugin. I'll loop this for you with it on, and have a look. So this basically opened up on the default, which just has the modulation actually more random, and we selected down here, so it was originally on the LFO, changed it to add a rhythm to it so that it fitted in more with the bass line and what else was going on in the groove. Changed it to half a note, and then just fiddled around with the mix and the frequency and resonance there to make sure that it was fitting in the right way. And you can do some really cool stuff with it if you wanted to add a bit more zap into it there, which actually would work in the track, which would fit in. You've got the capabilities to mangle the sound enough to make it different, but in this case, yeah, it's just simply coming on and off on a half note, phasing up and down. Yeah, I'd say all the synths we do use are vintage modulations, because that's the sound that we're going for. For bass, sometimes we'll use a Spectrasonics Trillion, some great subs on there, but again, the set of sounds that we'll go to will be the old school ones, the old Moogs, the Moog Fatty, and those kind of more old school sounding synths. As far as modern ones go, we used, maybe a few years ago, probably used some of the newer ones, the Rob Pappen stuff, which is really good. Diva, we used to kind of use those when we were making stuff that was slightly more kind of big room sounding, but we're now just all about the old school, like vintage stuff. And I'd love to be able to show you a real Moog in the studio, but unfortunately we don't have one yet. So that wraps up the first track. Having a bit of a break now. Make sure you come back and join me for part 2.